So after that really inspirational talk, Martino, thank you very much indeed. So you've set the scene for our panel discussion, which is about achieving frictionless knowledge exchange, or indeed should it be frictionless? So I think we'll hopefully have some good discussions. What we're going to do is we're each going to introduce ourselves, a little bit about our backgrounds and the organisations that we represent. Then each of us will talk about an example of knowledge exchange that we thought worked particularly well. And we'll have probably a little bit of a discussion around those. And then we're going to plunge into the bottlenecks and the obstacles and what can we do to address them. And then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion. And so we'll start off with the introductions. So I'll just start off with introducing myself. So my name is Barbara Domayne-Hayman. I'm entrepreneur in residence at the Francis Crick Institute. My background is I'm a chemist originally, but after my PhD, I went to the Darkside and I went into marketing and worked for 11 years in marketing in big companies, so in ICI, which became Seneca, etc., in agrochemicals. And then I had an early midlife crisis and I went to London Business School, where I discovered the world of entrepreneurship. And I decided that actually I wanted to go into biotech and use my scientific background, my business experience, and do something entrepreneurial. So I started off in cell tech and have basically worked for the last 18 years in a variety of biotech companies in different roles, so as in business development, as CEO, as chair, as non-exec directors. I also worked with Martino as entrepreneur in residence at the Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst for a while, and at the moment I wear 4 hats. So I'm Chief Business Officer at Therapeutics, where we're developing drugs for CNS disorders like schizophrenia and Alzheimer's, so we're doing all the easy ones. I'm also involved in 2 seed investment funds, so University of Cambridge Seed Investment Fund and also LifeArc Seed Investment Fund. And I'm entrepreneur in residence at the Francis Crick Institute, which on the diagram was the coccyx of the spine, I think, where I basically see a huge amount of very early, very exciting science and try to help it be translated. So I see a lot of early stage science and in the beginning of its translational journey, which I really love. So that's me. Daria?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Daria Donati, and I'm the Global Head of Business Development and Innovation at GE Healthcare Life Sciences, former Amersham Pharmacia. And what I do, basically, I take care of looking around in the company, around, constellation, creating partnership, and identifying interesting technologies that are in early stage development that the company might want to acquire or co-develop with partners. My background is actually an immunologist. I have 2 PhDs, one in transplant immunology and one in experimental medicine. Yes, one wasn't enough. So, certain people have tougher times. And after doing basic research at the Karolinska Institute for quite a few years, I worked in Central Africa with WHO, the multilateral initiative on malaria, where I was building capacity building programs with governments and international organizations around infectious diseases and malaria. And then suddenly I passed to the dark side because I thought I needed to learn the business side to trying to create an impact on the people that really needed. And in GE, I've been covering many different roles, worked in marketing, building one of the businesses that are creating turnkey solutions for manufacturing globally. And finally, I moved on the technology scouting side. And just to wrap it up, I would say that what really is the mission of the innovation and technology team, and that the full company is really trying to find innovative ways to accelerate precision medicine. Transferring technology, transferring knowledge and capabilities to scientists, developers, manufacturers in a way that together we can create innovative therapies for the toughest diseases. So we use tools, but together with knowledge to be able to create value in the technology space.
Great, thank you. Frank?
My name is Frank von Delft. I'm at the University of Oxford at the Structural Genomics Consortium, where I lead the crystallography group. I'm also at Diamond Light Source, which is a facility, national facility of the UK, providing X-ray, a facility for X-ray science. yeah, my background is a structural biologist, and I was one of the first PIs at the SGC back then, and in 2012, that was back in 2004, and in 2012 I also joined Diamond Light Source and to build up a new facility there. So as a crystallographer in the SGC, which obviously partners very closely with industry, but also actually importantly it's unusual as an academic environment because it's a very close-knit unit of many groups that have to work together very closely. That's usually what academics don't like doing. They like their own little fiefdoms, and so we are forced by the funding structure to work together with one another and work across many funders. That's been very healthy. I think it's also very goal-directed or deliverable-directed. But then what was frustrating as a structural biologist who joined the field, because I understood that if you do these protein structures, then drugs emerge, is to see just how little impact the structure actually has in the process and how many other things have to come into it. And so then I joined Diamond Light Source and took charge of one of these experimental stations, they call them beamlines, to see if we can repurpose that to make structural biology much more a leading technique in the drug design process. So there we built up the thing that we called XChem. It's a fragment screening facility where you do fragment screening directly in crystal structures, which wasn't a new technique, and in fact companies have been built up around it, most famously Aztecs over in Cambridge. But the idea was to democratize the process and make it, well, take it to the next step, first of all, with new technologies, but to make it completely broadly available to anybody who has a crystal structure or is doing structural biology and wants to truly impact the drug design. So it's been interesting sitting here at the interface of what industry had been doing, sometimes half-heartedly, sometimes full-throatedly, depending on the institution, and trying to make that technique available to everybody, and then exposing the naive academics who think they have an interesting idea to the reality of going beyond this initial experiment to actually take drugs or compounds to something that's potent and biologically useful, never mind going all the way to drugs. And there's a massive yawning gap there, which we're now trying to fill with some open source infrastructure projects, and also in partnership with the Rosalind Franklin Institute, which is being built up right next to Diamond Light Source. So our interaction also in this XChem facility has been very much to turn to industry and ask them how do they do it, and what are their current gaps, or if they don't have the gaps, how do they fill them, and then how can we make that part of the national infrastructure, or in fact international infrastructure, that academics can much more realistically engage with the downstream work and going towards potency. And it's interesting just how big that gap of expectation to impact is, and it's probably not unique to structural biology.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, so Iain.
Thank you, Barbara. So I'm Iain Thomas. I'm head of the University of Cambridge's technology transfer company Life Science Division. For my sins, I was a chemist in my early days, and I had the great pleasure, though, of a couple of wonderful postdocs in Oxford and Cambridge. And in Cambridge, I saw the group I was in, which was multidisciplinary and was a genuine multidisciplinary activity. We span out a company. I didn't participate in that, but it struck me as being, in those days, which was 97, 98, 99, considerably harder than it ought to have been. And I was kind of intrigued by that. And I realized I didn't have the skills to get involved with that. So I wandered off to business school, probably in error, because I discovered that business school was not the center of entrepreneurialism. It was almost a place that stifles it. And I found, of course, I said that for your pleasure. But seriously, I was always struck by this conundrum of how to take what was a great resource, which was in that case British science, and do something fantastically wonderful. Of course, it's a global activity, and so I found myself working in various business development roles and tech transfer roles before I ended up in Cambridge. And I think my focus through all of this has been, how can we take away a lot of the polarization, because I don't really believe that the polarization of language around industry versus academia, which I think is the word versus has changed, is helpful. I haven't always seen that this has built systems that has made it terribly easy to be as efficient as possible. I also don't believe frictionless is necessary. I actually don't want frictionless, but that's another matter. So to that end, and we as Cambridge Enterprise, but I've played my small part, have looked to build systems that have tried to look beyond the individual players, but think about how do you best solve moving insight, scientific insight, and possibly invention to some industrial outcome. We've done that with interesting funds with our seed funds, of which Barbara is on the investment committee. We've done it with our Apollo Therapeutics fund, which is not completely open. It is a semi-open, but also very closed activity. And we're trying to take those learnings about what makes this process effective and deploy it elsewhere. And in the context of CCF, we've taken some of our learnings from our Apollo fund and elsewhere, and we're trying to do that in agritech, an area in which I have little or no expertise.
Great, thank you. Martino, is there anything you want to add at this point?
I guess I should fess up and say I'm a biochemist by training.
I can't talk to you.
This is why there's this frictionless tension. I was that academic, that arrogant academic that wanted nothing but academia and a professorship and all of that. And I got to go out to Baylor and work with the scientists that developed the statins, came back to a postdoc, wanted a faculty position within Mark Ferguson's department, and he said to me, no chance. I think you should go into industry. Not going to employ people like you, going to go outwards, we're not going to employ internally. He wasn't saying I wasn't good enough, he was saying we're going to do it slightly differently, and that was game-changing. I went into a company where you could learn about R&D, manufacturing, and sales in one fell swoop. Was very privileged to take a product all the way from R&D into a gurney, into manufacturing, and then go on and sell it, white coat selling. I think Amersham Pharmacia were one of the first places to do technology sales rather than over in-your-face selling. So, and then, you know, the learning point for me was how cutthroat academia can be. Certainly Baylor was, I mean, that shaped me, that helped me to identify what I didn't want to be, because I was surrounded by cutthroat program managers, academics who were just, you know, dedicated to getting the funding in for themselves. And going into that academic industry interface, I had that thick skin that you need, because you get beaten up by the academics and beaten up by industry, so you get it from both sides. So I don't think frictionless exists.
Right.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, everyone. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some examples of things that we've seen or are seeing that seem to be working well. So I think I'll start off with an example from me. So at the Francis Crick Institute, translation really, there are sort of three key drivers, if you like. One is close proximity. So it's actually having experts in applied science and in business, with business expertise, working very closely with the academic scientists in the Crick. We accelerate tech transfer as much as possible, and we get clinical insights from very early stages of the programme, which is incredibly important. So I'd just like to focus in on the close proximity aspect. So we have pre-competitive collaborations with GSK and AstraZeneca, and others are in the pipeline as well. But that's actually not the area I wanted to talk about. We've got a very interesting internal grant-giving program called Ideas to Innovation, I2I. And that's basically an internal grant that helps scientists make the first steps towards translating their science. And it's typically up to about £75,000, and basically it's funded by the MRC and philanthropic funding, actually, to the tune of about £1 million a year. Crick's so far done, I think, 33 of those grants internally to the tune of about £2.7 million in total, and that's going extremely well. And the way actually they go to a selection committee, and it's called the Translation Advisory Group. And that advisory group really consists of incredibly, I was very impressed when I first arrived, really top people from industry, from academia, and also from biotech and entrepreneurs. And those, basically, the applicants present to that panel They don't always get it. They usually get through, but they don't always get through. But even those that do get through get a lot of tough love. They get a lot of input from the expert people on that panel. And then after that, once they actually started their program, then they get input from people who have the right expertise to help that particular research group. So, I'm entrepreneur in residence, but I mean, obviously I don't have expertise to cover everything by any means. I have quite limited expertise, but I do have a very good network. So basically what we try and do is we try and bring in people from the outside that have the right expertise to help every particular scientific program going forward. And that seems to be going extremely well. And actually now those projects are coming back for further funding, and we're actually looking to do a follow-on fund with slightly larger amounts of money to help those projects get translated to the point where they can either attract external investment or get other kinds of grant funding. So that's one example.
I can go on with another one. So if I look back, I've been working on partnership and alliances for life sciences for quite a few years now. And if I look back, every one of them had some positive aspect. We always aim to the moon, and we quite didn't reach the moon, but probably, we got a few steps in that direction. So we have been trying to learn through that, and I think one of the partnership for the moment is working best. Is a recent partnership that we built, and don't say because it's recent is working well. I mean, that's not actually the point, because it's a fast-moving one. It's a partnership with Vanderbilt University and Medical Center in US, where basically, we have, from the beginning, defined a common goal. So we both work in trying to implement the most innovative therapeutics in innovative personalized medicines, let's say. And how do we do that? We do bringing together the same goal and operating not in a non-competitive environment, because I don't really think it can be really frictionless and non-competitive, but identifying from the beginning the fact that we have common complementary interests. Everybody wants the final outcome. A company comes with the interest of developing tools, products, services, whatever you want. The university comes trying to push in the fastest way than possible new therapies, either getting successful fast or failure very, very fast. And that's what we think very much when we think about innovation. Sometimes it's never a positive outcome that you always want quickly. You might want to fail as fast as you can so that you can get the next one coming. So working with the Vanderbilt University, we decided to say, why we don't have for once a very wide partnership. We get the full GE Healthcare life science capabilities and not one single vertical. We work through genomics, cell analysis, AI implementation, apps, cellular manufacturing, bringing all of that together with the university, the medical center that wants to think about how to better stratify patients using PET imaging agents, how to purify and manufacture the new therapies, cell therapies of the future, and we do that. So we bring all the capabilities together, we identify clear projects, and we have champions. Because I completely agree with Martino. If there are no people that are clearly passionate about making a project work, this is so not going to work. So we have champions for each one of the different projects for both sides that have just the task to work as a team. This is actually going to work, we don't know, but for the moment is really moving very fast. And that's another of the key elements that we identified. Champions, clear purpose. The other one is KPIs, how the performance is actually measured. Usually academic centers and corporations, they have two different ways of measuring success. So if you're not aware of these differences from the beginning, you just work on parallel tracks and suddenly you move far away. And the last one, and then we can talk about the challenges later, is the timelines. The fact that partnership to be successful, they have to be a critical timeline. It can be 1 year, it cannot be 2 years. It has to be throughout the development of a full process. And usually people leave I mean, people move on, companies change strategies. So having a team that is really strong from the very beginning, engaging for a 5 years, 4 years period of time, and the two companies of organizations, public, private, can engage in maintaining a core center for this time, it has been really what has made the difference in the success so far for us.
Great, thank you. Frank.
I'll just speak a bit about the things I've been watching, especially at the Structural Genomics Consortium, and then things I had to myself take responsibility for at Diamond. So this is it's more the technology side, so it's much earlier than the going towards impact in clinic. It's about finding out how one can build the right structures or do the right projects that industry are interested in. And actually, it's a flow of information that goes in the opposite direction. How can we learn as much as possible from industry? And so it turns out that, well, I mean, this is not a surprise, but a lot of people in industry are extremely anxious to work with someone out there that can do something that they will never get funded, which is the interesting thing that you have at Diamond. It's a massive facility. It's core funded by the government. This money is guaranteed, or the thing is guaranteed to exist for a long time. So we can provide something that no company is ever going to bother setting up. I mean, why would they? So we can provide something very key. But what's kind of key here is the outflow, or the end point of where their input will go to is also well defined. There's no hidden agenda at Diamond. You know, we will build a facility that they can all use. So we find then that people are very anxious to engage and help. And I think so this maybe starts speaking to something you also touched on, is the economics of knowledge exchange, which I don't hear enough about, because it seems it matters a lot who funds it. It's a big topic in open source code development, which is part of what we're now entering into. You know, a lot of people like programming and contributing to projects, but who funds their salaries? Who makes sure that these guys, their investment doesn't vanish the moment the project fades? Where does that core funding come from? It's something that the facilities do have, and something that academics tend to not have, because we have to keep chasing after the next grant. So having watched how SGC was structured, which was basically a big core fund or one or two big core grants, it helps you just forget about those constraints and just get on with this interaction with industry. And then you get a lot of engagement from industry, because there's no hidden agendas. Everybody knows exactly what's going to be happening with that engagement. But I suppose talking about the tensions, the other thing about it is, so if you're building up a facility like we've had to do, the funding, if you like, or the remit of that facility is contingent on the knowledge exchange working. So I always have to defend myself to Diamond's management that we are being effective to industry. So if that is seen to start fading out, then they will start saying, well, actually, this XChem facility is no good. And but along with that, the funding is sufficient to allow us to deliver. And that is also key. We can't just go off and try and muck around a bit. We actually need to have enough funding to make something that is unique that the industry can engage with. And I think the same does apply to the SGC as well, that there's enough collective funding to get to the deliverables. And I think we should spend some time on this economics of knowledge exchange, because you talk about tension, but ultimately it comes down to everybody trying to make sure that they will still have a salary at the end of the project. And they have different mechanisms they go about that, and they all have everybody has a perception of what it will take. And in the end, that's what the bun fight is about. It's not really about, are we going to impact? It's how little can I get away with so that I will have a salary and still do something else useful. And I think that is where the tension actually arises.
I think that would be an interesting point to come back to, actually, the economics, definitely. Iain.
Thank you. So I couldn't agree more. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a program we put together with two universities in London, so that's Cambridge, Imperial and UCL, and three pharmaceutical companies, which was GSK, AstraZeneca and J&J. And it's our Apollo Therapeutics Fund, and it's about taking any therapeutic opportunity and developing it to a point where it's in-licensable by that small group of companies initially. But I think it's not so much those are the parties involved. It was why it was set up and what it was trying to achieve. And what we had seen, we all know great science and people are interested, and that's when we kind of all, everyone's frustrated by that not being quite as slick as we would like, if not frictionless. But what we had observed was that there were great programs out there. The Wellcome Trust has truly leading in its thinking with its seed and discovery program, and we'd been the recipients of some of those. But still, it didn't quite work as well as we would like. And it all came down to who had the right expertise, how was that expertise delivered, and what were people's incentives? Was it about keeping your postdoc going, or was it actually genuinely about moving the project in the right direction to an outcome that was genuinely on the route as efficiently as possible to patient benefit? Of course, people will benefit along the way. Commercially, they might sell a drug, which is going to make us money, going to make the company money. But all these processes seem to have lost sight of that. And we tried to set our Apollo Therapeutics up in a way that took out some of those, I guess, what you might call transaction costs. And as a result, it goes back to having the right people, it goes back to having the right infrastructure. So our Apollo Therapeutics was about having a team of people who could work with our academics, help them build projects, but then deliver those projects in a way that didn't necessarily have to happen in a university, but could be done with the right partners. That could be CROs, or it could be in part within our pharmaceutical partners. But taking out this notion of, although it's a pass the baton sort of thing, it was taking out this notion of these hard barriers. It was sort of, how do we solve, what's the best project we can build, and how do we best deliver it? Ignoring who employed you, who funded you, and those kinds of concerns. And I think to some degree it's been very, very effective. I mean, we got £40 million from our various partner participants, including the universities, and we're looking to go out and raise a lot more. But I think the key message to that is about this focus on the end game, and I think that's brought everybody together. It does help hugely that as long as the expertise, we have customers, heaven forbid we use the C word, the customer word, we have potential customers around the table, because they do sell and do things that are quite critical to this process. But it was that whole idea of trying to build projects agnostic or ignoring and I don't like the word because I think it's management sort of is misused by management to criticize, but ignore the silos from which we have to pass baton to baton, but do in a way that looks at what the overall agenda was, what we're trying to deliver, and then make sure we all had a fair return from the overall objective. And I think it's worked well. We haven't got any outcomes and licenses yet, but it's going to happen in the next few months. And more importantly, our pharmaceutical partners have been genuinely astonished about the breadth of exciting stuff they've seen, which they wouldn't see through this mechanism Teri did well, and the efficiency of decision-making and how things have been killed quickly for remarkably small sums of money, because it's not someone's pet project to keep going. It's not linked to a postdoc's worried about running out of cash, but it's linked to, as best as possible to core decision, the best decision-making that enables us to say go or not go and think about the patient. But yes, we want to make some money out of it. There's no doubt about that.
So can I just ask, how does the mechanism work at the other end? I mean, presumably, what if all three farmers were interested in a project? What would happen?
So all the pharma partners have a right to negotiate a license, and it's a competitive bidding situation.
Right.
Yeah.
But one hasn't gone all the way through yet.
We're in that process now, and it's a competitive bidding situation. And at which point, it is to recognise when it is legitimate to have attention, and when there are attentions which really just are daft.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Great. Martino, an example.
So at this stage, I usually talk about the Renovo story in Manchester, but I'm not going to do that today, and I'll just give you the bottom line. That had success and failure, and a hell of a lot more learning points from the failure than the actual successful bit. But my opinion is that there would not be a life science biotech cluster in Manchester were it not for Renovo. So let's park that. My motto is always take the opportunity to embarrass your chairman when you can. So I'm going to talk about the Puridify story, because I knew she wouldn't. So here's a story about two young dudes coming out of UCL, setting up a company around a technology for separation, and not really a clear idea on the business plan, but fortunate enough because of their ability to articulate and communicate to win a business plan competition called One Stop. And on the back of that, they got 6 months rent-free at the incubator in Stevenage. And they set up, and they then went out to get more money, but the best thing they did, and don't forget that people, infrastructure and money bit, was they brought in Barbara as their chairman. And all of a sudden, that company changed.
I knew them before that, actually.
Barbara, let me tell my story, then you can tell the truth. So, as I remember it, they brought Barbara in, and all of a sudden things changed. They grew up, they matured, they had the experience next to them. And Barbara, as an entrepreneur in residence at Stevenage, was so much better than I to go in front of them and say, are you sure you're doing the right thing? So she had a much better empathetic way of saying, sort it out and do it now. And on the back of that, they got more money and they were able to grow and pay their rent. And all of a sudden, they're using this one particular chromatographic separation method in the GE show lab. So GE have put 2.5 million of equipment into a lab at Stevenage. And they're using it so often that the other tenants are complaining. So GE come back and we put a bit of pressure and say, you need to buy that bit of kit now, and you can afford it because you've got investment. So they buy the kit, and immediately that triggers something at senior management in GE. And the senior manager at GE, this is how I'm telling the story, okay? The senior manager at GE says to his colleagues at Stevenage, go and find out what they do. Remember the bumper car model? And all of a sudden, GE are collaborating with Puridify. And all of a sudden, Puridify are now doing something in the cell and gene therapy space that makes them so much, their value proposition goes up exponentially. And to cut a long story short, GE acquires Puridify. So that has the whole open innovation, bumper car, people, infrastructure, money components. It's my favourite story.
Well, I won't spoil it by...
I don't, telling the truth. Yeah. That's how I remember. I'm old, Barbara.
That's fundamentally, it was actually the key point. I mean, I think these were two exceptional founders that were incredibly bright people. And I mean, I think it's nice because it weaves together so many of us actually on the panel today. And of course, what's happened since is that GE have actually invested in a manufacturing facility at Stevenage. So I think it's been a really positive thing.
And if I can add something in this specific case, is that when we acquired them, we really realized that the core of innovation couldn't be brought in by GE. So the decision was really to try to keep them as independent as possible as a little company. Let them going and innovating, because often when a big company comes in, the sparkle is gone. It's really just a huge truck passing through you. I mean, that's reality. That's how it is. So in this case, I think so far we have been smart enough to let them play in their lab, providing resources to their activity, marketing, manufacturing capacity, but still their integration in the company, it is sort of a little bubble where they can keep this innovation activity and pursuing their interest and application. And I think this has been actually a very good example of how, for once, we are trying to maintain the innovation that we brought in, and hopefully that will go for long.
And before I was rudely interrupted by Barbara trying to tell the truth, my understanding is that there was no semblance of frictionless transfer of knowledge and exchange. There were some tensions around the whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were always some tensions. I think what worked particularly well in that case actually was the relationship with UCL and the department there, where there was a very close relationship right from the start.
Brilliant.
But I mean, I think it was not without tensions in the spinning out process. And yeah, I think some of these things took longer than they needed to take and were more complicated, but I think that's fairly normal. But I think what happened at the end result was that in the end, all the stakeholders were happy. And I think that's actually a very rare situation, that actually all the stakeholders were happy, because I think everyone had a view on the longer term. And I think that's one of the things that I think is quite interesting, is that people have alluded to incentives and things like that, which I think can often get in the way. And I mean, I think, often people are kind of critical about, well, the tech transfer department is very slow, whatever. But I think, I mean, here it'd be interesting to get your comments here. I mean, I think one of the things that I think is that sometimes there's a lot of pressure on the universities for the tech transfer teams to actually create revenues. And it seems to me that there's often a pressure on people in the short term that basically if a young person in a tech transfer department basically is seen to be giving something away, there's immediately a potential for them to be basically, not do so well in their career or, negatively viewed. Whereas if they do something that's going to be very positive for the long term, the chances are they'll have left before that actually materializes. So for them personally, if they're relatively young in their career, they're going to be thinking massive downside risk, very limited upside opportunity. I'd better be very careful here and kind of go slowly and so on. So I think the incentives sometimes, it's difficult to align the incentives such that everybody is focused on, the long-term positive. What do you think?
I don't agree.
Good, okay.
No, but as always, I think I don't want to give a blanket answer because I don't think these things are universal answers across the country or across the world. I think that there is a fundamental difference between organisations and universities where there is massive long-term support for knowledge exchange, tech transfer, where there's significant history and a sophisticated understanding. I mean, Oxford, perfect example. That goes back. I'm not sure when you officially claimed to start, Adam, but the 31 is there you go. But actually, the university there has got a very sophisticated view of what it wants from that activity. Of course, it changes over time. It changes everywhere. But I think and I look at how we operate in our office, and I look at how you operate in other successful places which have got a long-term view, and that doesn't happen, and I think people would be strongly guided to taking a more sophisticated, longer-term view. I think where the challenges sometimes exist, because I think to claim that all is well, it would be foolish, would be inaccurate too. And the challenges exist often in places where there's maybe not quite the level of experience or sophistication, where where there isn't necessarily the fully under the support from people who above in university infrastructure to understand what outcomes can be, and people dive in and make comments and say, well, why didn't we make more money out of that, or what do we get out of that, and they didn't understand the process. And this goes back to, do you have buy-in to this real buy-in up to your vice chancellor level? So I think that is not always true in all places, so that you do get that problem. But I also think that it's a bit of an old story, because we have the impact agenda in the UK, which I think where universities are measured in some respects on the impact they have, which doesn't talk about the money. It does talk about things in a long-term way, and is actually a very sophisticated form of analysis of our performance. It's not perfect, nothing is. It's getting better, and I'm hugely supportive of it. And I think even the sort of criticism you lay is much less common than it was, even relatively recently. So I think it's a much more nuanced situation.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree. I mean, I think seeing over the last 20 years or so, I mean, it's been very, very clear that the calibre of the people that's been employed in the tech transfer offices, I think it's really transformed, and some really experienced, very, very brilliant people there now. But I think there is this patchiness. I mean, I think not all the TTOs are at the same level, unfortunately.
Can I just bring up something which doesn't seem to feature in these discussions ever, and that's the level of funding available and the amount of work one has to do to get the funding. We're talking about large numbers of ideas in large numbers of groups, and a lot of work to get even small amounts of funding of an investor or of the government or of some strategy fund or this or that. But if you wanted to convert all those ideas, we'd probably have to have several multiples of money much more easily available, so I don't have to worry about securing the money. I can worry about managing the project, managing the decisions. And it feels like there's something missing in the conversation. It's all about how are we going to secure profit. If someone's going to invest, this investor needs to have their return. And even the government, even if you apply to Innovate UK, they will say return of investment. What is return? It's a VC language that always seems to speak here. And that means the goal is wrong. The goal is money, it's not impact. And the first conversation is always about money, and it's not about to the patient. And is this something, I mean, that will always, almost by definition, inhibit the knowledge exchange, because you are first of all thinking about it converting to money. But if you look at what the Asian tigers did, or what China is doing now, they are throwing money against the wall and seeing what sticks, and they're throwing vast quantities of it, and they're not thinking about the profits. They're saying this is a future investment that has to be made collectively by the society, and they're finding routes of doing it. And I don't think in Britain we've managed that. You have to run the corridors of the VCs and wherever else, and really, really struggle to get money, doing a lot of convincing, which is a distraction from impact. And I don't hear this in the conversation.
Well, that's true, and I think we have an objective to increase our spend on R&D to 2.4% of GDP, which we're a long way from. But
even then, will it just flow, or will one have to do lots and lots of work to convince everybody that the idea is worth doing?
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
Because I think you make some very good points, but I don't completely agree with all of them. But I think one of the things that we struggle with here is that people go out looking for very defined, clear, relatively small pieces of money that don't have necessarily a long plan or clear solution as if we're successful, how this is going to go on afterwards. This is pre-formal investment. And I think building structures that enable that and say, well, actually there is a lot more money and you have it in advance, but if you fail,
that's fine.
And I think we
that's important. That is important.
Yes, so I think we haven't done that as well as we could in places.
But you should be able to fail without your career going down the tubes.
Oh, goodness me, yes.
But that's the problem right now. If in academia, for instance, if you don't get papers, there won't be a grant. Goodbye, your group and your own career. So we don't have a structure to know, okay, this is the way to go, and if I do the right decisions, that project can keep going, and I can contribute. And there will be longevity in the expertise and the know-how. I don't see that mechanism at all in any conversation. Everyone seems to have to patch together their funding in some ways. And I think it still goes also for investments in private sector. You still have to patch together your funding. And it's not obvious that there's a good route that gives people the confidence to take risks. Because it's almost, we are pre-programmed to not take risks because we want to satisfy a lot of people that have strong opinions and who are sitting on the money tap.
So what would you suggest, Frank? What kind of funding structure would you advocate?
In the communist socialist world, you'd have the government that will say, we're going to put 2.4% of GDP into this, and your approval process is very low barrier, but the decision tracking is very high quality. So you can think of mobilizing nationally the expertise that would help contribute to decisions. Mm-hmm. The projects can start faster and then fail better.
And we're not very good at doing failure.
Fair enough.
How many times?
Because our careers depend on it.
Yeah, no. But how many times have you seen people something not go well and go, on this one you can have the money back?
Because if I say that to anybody, my colleagues will say fail. No. As opposed to succeed. Well failed.
Yes, I know.
It's a mindset thing.
I agree entirely.
Martino, do you have
So I have a less socialist view of the world. I absolutely agree on enhancing the bandwidth, and that is through more R&D spend. But if you talk on both academic and investment side, technology transfer and investors talk about a funnel. And you have to have that attrition. Not everything, there has to be failure as well as success. So it's not a handout, and there has to be a process, and there has to be KPIs. But not everything should be about commercial. There should be societal, and there should be patient benefit. So what we're not doing well enough yet is making that assessment early enough on what route of travel to go, because they're not usually closely correlatable. So open the bandwidth, but don't get rid of the funnel and the due diligence. There has to be failure.
But can I contrast this? There's two major contrasting things in healthcare. One is health provision. In the UK, we have this thing called the NHS, which for decades has been running on a non-profit basis and is extremely effective in terms of cost benefit. And then the drugs that are integral to healthcare are entirely profit-driven. And there's no mechanism that anybody discusses about developing drugs in a non-profit way. Nevertheless, it seems to be an effective organizational structure for at least part of our healthcare. Can one not merge this? Isn't there a future benefit to be had in productivity increases if we get better at drugs in 10 years' time? We'll save massive amounts of NHS. Is there no way to mobilize that saving into research now? I don't see that joined-up conversation happening. It feels like it should be mobilizable in some way to activate funding now. Nothing you say about decisions and failure is incorrect. I totally agree. One needs that tension. This project isn't going anywhere. You're not doing it well. Stop. But your career isn't done. You can still contribute elsewhere.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. Yeah. Shall we open it up to questions from the floor?
Can I just start with that tension?
Who are you? Sorry.
I'm Chris Buckley. I work in Birmingham and Oxford. I have a joint appointment, and I'll be talking a little later about the Oxford-Birmingham M40 Alliance, which is a new kid on the block, just to whet your appetite. But I want to come to this issue of the NHS because it hasn't been discussed so far, and it's one that's relevant if we're going to have healthy ageing. You could argue ageing is not a disease. It's a normal process, just like inflammation is a normal process. It's just how it's managed. And I wonder, when we talk about frictionless knowledge transfer, you've talked at the interface between having an idea and getting it somewhere, but then you make something out of that, and that has to be adopted. And to me, you have to work at that very tough interface between a university and an NHS. You might think industry and university is bad, but that's even tougher because of the problems you've just raised, which is actually one is about bidding for money in a very kind of peer review process where failure is taken in a very positive way, and one where the NHS is not allowed to fail because it gets core funding according to the number of patients you have, and there isn't a structure to say how good it is because there isn't any way in which you can appraise that. And I wondered what the panel's view is at that interface. Have they any experience about working in the NHS directly and what that interface might be like in terms of frictionless?
Well, I mean, I can start with an example which is kind of obliquely relevant. So I think it picks up on the point of the NHS, but also interfaces. So at the Francis Crick Institute, at the moment, we've just completed our first cohort of a new accelerator called KQ Labs. So KQ stands for the Knowledge Quarter, which is actually exactly where we are here. The British Library is the epicentre of the Knowledge Quarter. And what this accelerator was, it's aimed at supporting startups at the interface of artificial intelligence and biomedical. So basically data science meets biomedical science. So it's based on two observations. One is that interfaces are difficult areas. And they're not properly supported by either ecosystem. So basically, because this is data science meets biomedical science, the data science world of VCs looks at it and says, oh my God, it's got all these regulatory implications. We're not really understanding that. It's not got the same profile of metrics and it's not going to go to revenues quickly. We're not going to support it. And the biotech VCs are going, oh God, it's got all this data, don't really understand it. So they're not really supporting it. So there's this real gap of things that are emerging at this really exciting interface area that are not being properly supported. And at the same time, the observation is that King's Cross, where we're sitting now, is actually potentially the epicenter of an ecosystem, which, because you've got the Alan Turing Institute right here, you've got the Crick next door, you've got Wellcome, you've got UCL, you've got Benevolent AI, you've got Google DeepMind, you've got all these ingredients for an ecosystem right here. So what we've done is we've run an accelerator for startups in this data science meets biomedical science area. And you're wondering why the relevance to the NHS. Well, actually, most of them are actually potentially selling to the NHS because they're selling solutions.
The problem you've just highlighted, selling to the NHS.
Yes, exactly.
Have you ever tried to sell to the
Exactly. And the point is that for these startups, it's potentially the valley of death because, you know, it takes so long to actually get to a proof of concept, to actually sell, that it's an enormous problem.
So maybe turn that problem into a great opportunity, because the one thing the UK has that's very unique is the NHS.
Absolutely.
No other country has that.
No,
so you have to look at it as to how you...
Indeed.
That's my challenge for you.
And indeed, and actually what we've done as part of this accelerator is we've involved people like Health Data Research UK and Genomics England, so basically involving the unique aspects of the British ecosystem where you've got these deep pools of data.
If I was chief executive of an NHS organisation, why would I want to buy that from you?
why would we want to buy the technology? Because it has potential impact for patients' lives. So a couple of them have direct impact on healthy aging, for instance. One is related to ophthalmology issues related to aging. Another is to do with cancer. I mean, these are things that have potentially very rapid impact. And unfortunately, I'm actually saying to the companies, look, you're getting really stuck in the NHS here. Don't give up, but actually also look at the US, because it might be that you'll be able to get some traction more quickly with the US. So I think it's really difficult. And I think once you're a startup company, you have to survive, and you've got to find the best way to survive. And if that's actually going to the US, then that's the way they're going to have to do it. But obviously, we want them to get engaged with the NHS.
I would think, perhaps I'm hogging the questions, but I think about it a completely different way. Not about trying to sell it, but perhaps we can discuss it.
Well, that sounds interesting. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting discussion, and I don't think it applies only to NHS. It's companies look at the problem in a different way. Mm-hmm. Startup companies and academics, they develop a technology that solves a problem they believe it's there. Mm-hmm. Companies look at objective needs in the market. Mm-hmm. It can be the director of NHS that has cost problems, and then trying to translate back, finding the appropriate technology or constellation. So I think the interaction between academics, startups is very, very, in industry, it's very, very important. Why? Because we looked at from the need perspective, mm-hmm. and we walk the way back. Mm-hmm. So that there is always a house at the end of the development. That's what worries us most. So the NHS probably will have this type of approach. And how do we do that better? Because if you take each and every problem from the end, you will kill the open innovation, you will keep the open thinking, and you will kill innovative technologies. I don't think there is a solution, but I think that there is a good point. How do you bring the need first to be able to funnel it in the right direction?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Brad.
Martino, on one of your slides, you actually had the word culture, but you didn't actually mention it. Now, if I think this whole game is just about people, infrastructure, and money, then frankly, we've lost the race to China and the US already. I am worried about culture in this country for many of the reasons you've talked about. I think two of you today commented that you moved to the dark side. I think we should get rid of that terminology. And I think Frank touched on it, Martino touched on it. I think one of the things that's slowing down knowledge exchange in the UK is competition between academics for funding, competition between universities for funding, competition between science parks for funding.
Comments?
I think there's all sorts of things I agree with there, but it all relates to one thing. We've polarized the discussion in all sorts of dimensions. It may be the dark side versus the light side. Words that only cross my lips in this conversation because of you. But we polarize even this. We have industry versus academia, which is why I chose that word. And I think we haven't got to. We've got to develop that culture to recognise that we're all part of a continuum. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the gentleman's question about the NHS. There's a whole load of, and I won't go into specifically answering that, but I'm happy to take it at lunch, but we have got a whole load of polarised languages where I'm in this boat and somehow I've got to be looked after and maybe I'm more virtuous. I'm not sure what's motivating it, or I've got to look after myself. And I don't think we have got that to work in enough people's minds, and I think I think it's a lot to do with the way that we, the British, think, and I do carry a British passport. Yeah.
So, how can you argue about people and not talk about culture? So in my mind, when I talk about people, I do imply that culture changes. I mean, the bullet point said change the culture in the NHS. And I feel like I'm kind of able to say something like that, having been an entrepreneur in residence at the Central Manchester Trust and seen how the Genome Campus with QIAGEN is evolving and developing on hospital campus. Key thing there is it's not the CEO of the NHS that's making the decision. Manchester has a devolved budget. And so the CEO of the Manchester Health Trust is able to say, we want this here in Manchester. And he's going out publicly and saying, you better change the culture. My brother's a GP, and he's actually saying the interns and the medics that he's teaching now, they're all got their own apps. The starting point is there, not where my brother was, and not certainly where Mike Deegan was 25 years ago in Manchester. The culture's changing automatically. We need to build on that. I'm not saying it's a lost generation and lost hope. There's what's going on at Granary Square. There's what's going on at the Genome campus. I think Oxford's got big plans to make it happen. Bumper car, proximity, get it to happen. Adoption, the NHS is the hardest part of the market, without a doubt. Without a shadow of doubt. I've had companies in Manchester and Stevenage not doing clinical trials in England, in the UK, because it's easier to go and do it in Germany and Singapore and elsewhere. That is shocking. We need to change that. And the adoption of medtech, hopefully Devices for Dignity and other organisations are going to help change that. But it's a generational thing. People, culture, the next generation will be better. So, unfortunately, I'm saying not in my lifetime, I think, but we hope for the best.
I mean, I take the point, Chaz. I mean, I said Darkside as a joke, frankly. I will not use that term in future if there's any risk of it being misconstrued. I think the culture is changing, actually. I mean, I think the fact that at the Crick there are these people embedded from industry, from entrepreneurial backgrounds. I think there isn't this them and us feeling at all anymore. I think it is going in the right direction. It's taking time.
Is that because salaries are just as precarious in industry as they are in academia?
There is no security anywhere anymore. I mean, I think that's a reality.
We're all in the same boat, kind of.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think absolutely.
But I do
right.
think that if we want to, going forward, compete with the US and China, then I think we do need to change the culture. We need to create a culture that we all recognize that the University of Cambridge on their own can't tackle some of these big problems. And we're going to have to work together with other academic centres, with other industries, with governments, with regulators, with payers, etc. We've got to do that. I think we've got to start focusing on really big problems. I think we've got to be much more risk-taking. And I completely agree with Frank. We need government to create these core funding streams for that sort of big core infrastructure, just like they've done in Harwell, etc., etc.
No, I agree. And I think the point of the competition is well made. And I think certainly with the KQ Labs, where we're trying to get an ecosystem built on for this completely new area, where the UK has the potential to be a very, very strong force alongside the US and China, we're trying to actually get to treat the UK as like one cluster, certainly to treat the southeast of England as one cluster, because that's what we are, really. Right, next question.
Hi, Lynn Cox, Biochemistry, Oxford. I'd like to follow up Frank's point about the time it takes to get small pots of money, how much investment is required to get financial investment, and also the longevity and the far-sightedness of funding, because we're working on 3-year grant cycles maximum. You're trying to run a project that really should have a 10-year approach to it and vision, and you're trying to complete and meet your deadlines and get your papers published within a 3-year timescale, and it's simply not a viable option. Whereas institutions like the Crick and like the LMB, they do extremely well because they have vision and longevity to the projects. So how is the culture of academia and the funding system in academia going to change so that we can actually take the long view and make things happen properly?
Great question. Would anyone like to comment?
Welcome Investigator awards are for up to 7 years.
And very hard to get.
Sorry?
Not if you've got a university lectureship, you have to resign it.
To get a Welcome Investigator? No, not at all.
Really?
No, absolutely not. No, you're thinking of principal research fellowship.
Yes. Okay.
No, Investigator awards are for everybody, and they're for up to 7 years. So it's not quite as long-term as an LLB or being a core member of the Crick. But there are funding mechanisms for longer term.
Can I just it sort of follows on from Chaz's point, and I sympathise. We're not in that game, but going back to the sort of discussion that Frank and I had a little bit on beforehand, is do you think your community is open to if it gets given longer time horizons, which I fundamentally support? how do you see, would you be open to different ways of managing that and saying, actually, this horse is long dead and you shouldn't have been flogging, and I think it's about and I think that's is how you manage that, because then because if you have got that freedom, you can then deploy it on another super challenging activity, and I think that sort of goes with how do you deal with these big challenges which are long term. So
yeah, if I just say something, I mean, I think this is where portfolio funding is really important. Yeah. And SGC do this. Basically, you're doing a portfolio of projects, and if something, you're banging your head against the wall of a project which simply won't express or whatever, you kill it, right, and then move on. And the same with our drug discovery programs. We have MRC, confidence and concept money, for example, for our non-neglected disease stuff. And there we have a portfolio of collaborations, and if they're not tractable, we kill them. And this generates huge efficiencies. The UK funding organisations are really only beginning to get their heads around this concept that you could give organisations that have a certain level of capacity and capability portfolio funding, and you'll get much better value for money than, for example, MRC DPFS, which is one project at a time. Yes. As you say, nobody hands the money back, even when they should shoot the project in the head after 4 months, maybe.
It's not hard to build up a panel of experts that you bring in for a day to kill things. I mean, everybody likes to be smart in front of colleagues, right? So I think there's enough expertise around the country. If you just convene it the right way, you could have that mechanism happening.
Mm-hmm. But so my final point was that this then requires a huge amount of discipline from the academics to run a portfolio and to really be serious about what they stop. But it can be done.
Well, they can learn.
There are good examples.
We don't get trained to do that. We have to learn it.
Yeah.
So,
but we can roll that out a bit further, I think.
But the smartest people are very comfortable with doing that and recognising that the horse is now dead.
Well, if they'd stop doing it, they don't get the money. I mean, there are ways to make that the incentive, right?
Yeah. No.
Barbara, can I just say, Chaz's point about we need to compete with America and Singapore, but I would argue, what in? There's not that integrity to say, but we're the best in the world at oncology, or we're the best in the world at this, but we're not the best at cardiovascular, or that's somewhere else. I think that discipline has to come alongside the portfolio management.
Yeah. Last question from the audience, and then we'll have to stop.
Janet Lord from Birmingham. So I think there's another tension here. We haven't really spoken about this so far. So at the moment, most of our drug discovery is based on single drug, single disease. Old age is very rarely a single disease. It's a multi-morbid situation. So I'd like you to address that tension. Also swiveled against the current, we've got the Industry Strategy Challenge Fund, which of course wants a return and impact very quickly. And we've also had some points of that already, that the tendency then is to go for a tech solution. And I think most of us, if we really want healthy aging, I don't want to monitor decline in our older adults. I actually want to stop it. So I'd like some comments on this tension between a quick result with a tech solution to monitoring versus a longer-term solution where you've really got to look at multi-morbidity and completely different ways of carrying out, geriatric medicine.
Well, very interesting question. And I'll just start the ball rolling here and then pass it over to my colleagues. So, I think I completely agree with you. The text cannot be a solution in itself, but I think it can be a very interesting companion solution. So, for instance, one of the companies in the cohort of the KQ Labs that we've just graduated actually looks at monitoring age-related macular degeneration, and it looks at potentially changing the frequency of the injections, which are currently on a very regular regimen, very rigid regimen, of actually people only going in when they need to go in, and enabling that monitoring to be done in an environment which is easy for them to access. They don't have to go to the hospital, queue up for 3 hours every time. So that's not in itself a solution, but it's a companion to other things. So I think it's all part of building this very complex ecosystem of multimodal approaches. I think, obviously polypharmacy and is essential for the elderly. I'm not sure what you can do about that. I think it's...
Actually, I would argue it's not essential. That is the current model, and the model is broken.
Right.
What you need is a solution. Sorry. So I would argue that's where we are now. We're in polypharmacy because we're treating multimorbidity, single disease, single drug, so you end up with polypharmacy. what we're arguing and what we're aiming at in spine is to actually tackle the core aging processes so that you don't end up with polypharmacy or you minimise the polypharmacy. But I think it's a real culture change in pharma and in medical research as well to think that, you know, we move away from this single drug, single disease model.
So you mean you can actually get to the actual root cause?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I mean, that would obviously be fantastic.
And that's what spine is all about.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I'm far away from being an expert in late stage diseases, but what has been happening in general in the evolvement of disease etiology has been a movement probably started 6-7 years ago on polymicrobial diseases. And we are, I think, starting to think about each and every disease like the result of many different interactions. The area in which I've been working is infectious diseases, but I think the sensibilization and the starting to have the scientific society thinking that is not anymore one factor, one microbe, but is a composition of different factors contributing to that, and might spread into other application areas from the infectious diseases, and probably bring into that new technologies and new ways of thinking. I'm not really sure that's true in other application areas, but I see really an enormous amount of papers coming out on polymicrobial diseases, something that before was never considered. And that has been spreading into innovative technology in how to, in the same time, monitor the performance of our gut compared to our immune system on a single device. So I don't know if that's applicable exactly, but there is a movement towards that. And I think probably opening a little bit our spectrum and trying to apply what has been done in other application areas might help.
Can I just maybe pick up Chris's point about the NHS as a challenge as opposed to a resource? I mean, there are lots of smart people in the NHS. In fact, the employees of the NHS are selected by smartness, right? The doctors have got very stringent criteria. But I'm married to a junior doctor, and I see how little time and bandwidth they have for anything. Not only because of the funding shrinking, but because the output or the outlet of the NHS, which is a social infrastructure, isn't there. So if she spends 4 hours on the phone trying to get a geriatric patient who can be released out, that is wasted time. Is there some way to free up their the intelligence and their creativity to work with the people that have the ideas and drive knowledge exchange? What can one do within the NHS to empower them? Because I also see junior doctors are not empowered to take initiative. They've got very rigid training regimes, which are really constrain what they have to do. And they don't have the time to push these things. So I wonder if that is where some of the culture change can also be productive, that be smarter collectively as a society about how to use that resource and use it, not see it as a challenge.
Okay. Right, I think we're going to have to draw it to a close. Yes, exactly. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.